November 12, 1942, Richmond, California. Kaiser Shipyard Number Two. The air smelled of welding torch ozone and fresh paint. 7,000 tons of raw steel had been transformed into the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Workers in denim and women in coveralls stood on the slipway as the Liberty ship slid into San Francisco Bay. A publicity stunt designed to prove what American industry could accomplish when it abandoned convention and embraced speed. Reporters scribbled notes. Photographers captured the moment. And across the Atlantic, in the concrete bunker of German Naval Command headquarters, intelligence officers would soon translate these newspaper accounts into reports that Admiral Karl Dönitz would refuse to believe. The achievement seemed impossible by every standard the Germans understood. A ship of that size required precision engineering, skilled craftsmen, months of careful assembly. Yet here was photographic evidence of a vessel constructed faster than a German shipyard could complete preliminary welding on a single hull section. The Americans had not merely accelerated production. They had redefined what production meant. January 1939. Berlin. Adolf Hitler had approved Plan Z 3 weeks earlier, a naval construction program that would give Germany 230 major warships by 1947. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder presented the blueprint with confidence. 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 armored ships, 68 destroyers. The Kriegsmarine would challenge British naval supremacy and strangle Allied supply lines. German shipyards would work methodically, employing master craftsmen trained in traditions stretching back generations. Quality would triumph over quantity. German engineering precision would prove superior to mass production. Plan Z represented everything the German military mind valued: thoroughness, technical excellence, adherence to proven methods. A Danube vessel required 9 months to build. A submarine took nearly a year from keel to commissioning. These timelines reflected proper shipbuilding, the careful work of skilled men using techniques perfected over decades. The idea that ships could be assembled like automobiles was dismissed as American fantasy, the sort of industrial corner cutting that produced inferior vessels destined to sink in their first Atlantic storm. The German generals expected a European war they could win before American industrial capacity became relevant. Intelligence assessments in 1940 noted that the United States ranked 17th globally in army size, trailing Romania. American aircraft production stood at roughly 300 planes monthly. Tank production barely registered. The American shipbuilding industry had constructed only 2 ocean-going dry cargo freighters between 1922 and 1937, a collapse so complete it suggested permanent industrial decay. German planners calculated that even if America entered the war, mobilization would require years, time enough for Germany to secure Europe and negotiate from strength. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. May 1943, North Atlantic. The Wolfpacks withdrew. For 3 years, German U-boats had waged war on Allied shipping with devastating effectiveness. Dönitz's submarines had sent millions of tons to the ocean floor, strangling Britain's supply lines, threatening to win the war through attrition. In March 1943, German submarines had sunk over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. Victory seemed within reach. The mathematics were simple: sink ships faster than the Allies could build them and Britain would starve. Then the numbers changed. In April, Allied losses dropped to under 300,000 tons. In May, 41 U-boats were sunk, more than 10% of the operational fleet lost in a single month. The exchange rate had reversed catastrophically. For every merchant ship destroyed, Germany lost a submarine and its trained crew. On May 24th, Dönitz ordered the temporary withdrawal of U-boat Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic, a tactical retreat that acknowledged mathematical reality. The Americans were building ships faster than Germany could sink them. Much faster. The reports reaching German Naval Command described production rates that violated everything they understood about shipbuilding. Liberty ships were being completed in an average of 42 days from keel laying to delivery. Not 42 days of hull construction, 42 days total, including complete fitting with engines, navigation equipment, crew quarters, and cargo handling gear. 18 shipyards were producing these vessels simultaneously. At peak production in 1943, the United States was launching an average of 3 Liberty ships every day. 3 complete ocean-going vessels, each capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo across the Atlantic, rolling off American slipways daily like automobiles from a Detroit assembly line. German intelligence officers struggled to verify reports that seemed to describe industrial fantasy. The numbers were checked and rechecked. Observers in neutral countries confirmed the reports. Swedish businessmen saw the newspaper photographs. Swiss bankers processed the financial documentation. Spanish diplomats watched the ships sail. The numbers were not propaganda. They were real. In 1943, American shipyards produced more than 19 million deadweight tons of merchant shipping. Germany's entire wartime production, from 1939 through 1945, amounted to less than 2 million tons. The United States built more ships in 12 months than Germany constructed in 6 years of total war. The disparity was so vast it seemed to mock the very concept of strategic planning. The wolf packs that were supposed to strangle Allied supply lines had become irrelevant, not through tactical defeat but through industrial arithmetic that rendered their victories meaningless. Albert Speer understood. Hitler's Minister of Armaments possessed an architect's precision and an industrialist's grasp of production capacity. When reports of the Robert E. Peary reached his office, when intelligence summaries documented American shipyard output, Speer recognized what he was seeing. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of wartime production, not through superior craftsmanship, but through superior organization. They had abandoned the German approach entirely, rejected the model of skilled craftsmen, carefully assembling complex machines, and instead created an industrial system that treated ships as collections of standardized components that semi-skilled workers could weld together with minimal training. The method was revolutionary in its simplicity. Traditional shipbuilding assembled vessels from keel to deck, one crew working sequentially on each section. Henry Kaiser's yards in Richmond fabricated entire ship sections simultaneously across multiple locations, while one team built a bow section in the prefabrication area. Other teams constructed stern sections, deck houses, engine rooms, and bulkheads in parallel. When sections were complete, massive cranes lifted them onto building ways where welding crews joined them together. The technique required enormous space. West Coast yards spread across acreage that East Coast facilities could never accommodate, but it cut construction time by more than half. Welding replaced riveting, a shift that offended German engineering sensibilities but proved transformatively efficient. Riveting required skilled workers, men who had apprenticed for years to master the craft. Welding could be taught in weeks to workers who had never seen the inside of a shipyard. Women comprised nearly 20% of the Kaiser Shipyard workforce by 1943. African Americans, whom Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior, operated complex machinery and supervised construction teams. Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, workers of every background the Germans considered unsuitable for precision industrial work, built ships with production efficiency that exceeded German output per worker by a factor of 3. The German system, with its emphasis on master craftsmanship and technical perfection, was simply incapable of this kind of production. German submarine construction had risen from 23 boats in 1939 to a peak of 387 in 1944. That represented a massive increase, a mobilization of German shipbuilding capacity that strained every resource. Yet in 1943 alone, the United States constructed over 100 escort carriers using Kaiser's mass production techniques. These small aircraft carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, provided air cover for Atlantic convoys and turned the Battle of the Atlantic decisively against the U-boats. Germany built 1,156 submarines during the entire war. America built more escort carriers in 2 years. November 1943. Wehrmacht High Command. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen examined captured American supply documents from the Italian campaign. The intelligence officer had built his reputation on precise analysis, mathematical assessment of enemy capabilities, unclouded by ideology. The documents before him showed supply flows to a single American corps: fuel deliveries, ammunition tonnages, food shipments, medical supplies, spare parts, clothing, equipment. He compared these figures to supply allocations for entire German armies. The ratio was approximately 4-1. A single American corps received more material support than 4 German divisions. Gehlen understood what this meant. The supplies did not materialize from captured territory or conquered populations. They came from American factories operating across an ocean, production facilities so vast they could support military operations on 2 continents while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded German peacetime prosperity. He drafted his assessment with characteristic precision. American industrial production had rendered German victory mathematically impossible. The United States produced 3 times as many tanks as Germany in 1943, 37,000 compared to 12,000. American aircraft production reached 85,000 planes, while Germany managed fewer than 21,000. American steel output totaled 81 million tons versus Germany's 30 million. The report reached Hitler's desk. It was filed and ignored. Ideology trumped arithmetic. The Führer had built his worldview on the assumption of Slavic inferiority, Jewish weakness, American decadence. Numbers that contradicted this framework were dismissed as defeatist exaggeration, the product of overcautious intelligence officers who lacked faith in German will. Gielen's mathematical precision was treated as pessimism. His accurate assessments were rejected by leaders who preferred comforting fantasies to uncomfortable facts. Hermann Göring, captured after the war and interviewed in prison, admitted the scale of German miscalculation. When asked about American shipbuilding capability, the Reichsmarshal's response carried the weight of belated recognition. "We understood your potential," he said. "However, the tempo of your shipbuilding, for example, Henry Kaiser's program, surprised and upset us. We had rather minimized the apparently exaggerated claims in this field. At first, we could not believe the speed with which your merchant marine was growing. Claims of 8 to 10 days to launch a ship seemed fantastic. Even when we realized it referred to the assembly of prefabricated parts, a mere 10 days to put it together was still unthinkable." Göring's words revealed the deeper failure. German leadership had believed American production figures were propaganda, inflated numbers designed to intimidate. Even when neutral observers confirmed the statistics, even when photographic evidence accumulated, the Nazi command structure resisted accepting what the numbers meant. German shipbuilding was thorough and painstaking, disturbingly slow in comparison to American methods. A culture that prized craftsmanship over efficiency, that valued traditional methods over innovation, found itself unable to compete with a system designed around speed and scale. The Liberty ship became the symbol of American abundance, the physical manifestation of industrial capacity that Germany could not match. 2,710 of these vessels were constructed between 1941 and 1945, more ships of a single class than had ever been built. They were not beautiful. Maritime experts derided their simple design, called them floating coffins, predicted they would break apart in Atlantic storms. Some did. Brittle fractures in welded hulls, stress concentrations at square hatch corners, design flaws born of speed over perfection. But for every Liberty ship lost to structural failure, 100 crossed the Atlantic carrying tanks and trucks and ammunition and food, the supplies that sustained Allied armies and made German victory impossible. The German generals had expected American workers to be soft, unprepared for industrial warfare. Instead, they encountered a workforce that had survived the Depression, people who understood hardship and brought desperate energy to war production. Shipyard employment exploded from 50,000 workers in 1939 to nearly 1.7 million by 1943. These workers operated 3 shifts, around the clock, every day. At peak production, Kaiser's Richmond yards employed 90,000 people working 24 hours daily, producing more tonnage in a month than some German shipyards completed in a year. The transformation was visible in the numbers, but also in the details, the small signs of abundance that German observers found incomprehensible. American shipyards discarded more aluminum scrap in a day than German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. Food processing plants destroyed perfectly edible produce for minor cosmetic flaws, tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, beans with minor blemishes, all discarded while German civilians faced starvation. The waste itself became evidence of productive capacity beyond German understanding. A society wealthy enough to discard what others would treasure. German prisoners of war, transported by train across the American interior, witnessed the industrial landscape with growing comprehension. They passed Ford's Willow Run plant, a single factory that produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that exceeded the monthly aircraft output of Germany's entire aviation industry. They saw blast furnaces in Pennsylvania operating continuously, producing more steel in single months than Germany's Ruhr Valley could manufacture during equivalent periods. They crossed the Mississippi River on bridges that carried more freight daily than German railways could move in weeks. The cumulative effect was psychological devastation, the destruction of Nazi mythology through direct observation of American abundance. The food particularly stunned them. German POWs in American camps gained weight while their families starved. They ate beef and chicken and fresh vegetables, foods that had become memory in wartime Germany. They received Red Cross packages containing chocolate and coffee and canned goods that were luxuries beyond price in Europe. The disparity was so vast it seemed deliberately cruel, though it was merely the natural product of different industrial systems. America produced food with the same mass production efficiency it applied to ships and planes and tanks, agricultural abundance that made feeding millions of prisoners a minor logistical challenge rather than an economic burden. Liberation for German POWs meant return to ruin. They brought knowledge of American plenty to a land of absolute scarcity. They had witnessed production capacity that did not require conquest, prosperity through creation rather than extraction. Their testimony influenced German acceptance of the Marshall Plan, shaped West Germany's post-war economic approach. The men who had seen American factories understood that wealth came from production systems, not from territorial expansion or subjugation of inferior peoples. The lesson was learned through defeat, through mathematical proof that ideology could not overcome industrial arithmetic. The Liberty ship endured beyond the war. Vessels designed for a 5-year lifespan sailed for decades, carrying peacetime cargo, proving more durable than maritime experts had predicted. They became merchant vessels for dozens of nations, tangible evidence of American wartime production spread across the world's oceans. Some served into the 1960s, workhorses whose simple design and robust construction outlasted more sophisticated vessels. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, launched in 1943, survived as a museum ship, her triple expansion steam engine still operational, a physical reminder of the industrial transformation that overwhelmed German military power. The German generals had been wrong about everything that mattered. They were wrong about American resolve, wrong about industrial capacity, wrong about the speed at which democracy could mobilize for total war. They dismissed American production claims as propaganda, and discovered too late that the propaganda had understated reality. Franklin Roosevelt's 1940 call for 50,000 aircraft seemed fantastically impossible to German planners. America ultimately produced over 300,000 planes, exceeding Roosevelt's ambitious target by a factor of 6. Every German calculation, every strategic assumption, every confident prediction proved false when confronted with American industrial output. The mathematics were irrefutable. Germany produced 63,000 tanks during 6 years of total war. America produced 88,000 tanks while maintaining civilian automobile production until 1942, then converting those same factories to produce aircraft engines and military vehicles at rates that made German production seem negligible. German artillery production totaled 625,000 guns. American factories produced 372,000 artillery pieces while simultaneously producing millions of small arms, billions of rounds of ammunition, quantities of war material that suggested industrial capacity without meaningful constraint. The shipyards were merely the most visible symbol of a larger transformation. America mobilized not through ruthless efficiency or totalitarian control, but through capitalist competition channeled toward national purpose. Private companies operated the shipyards under government contracts. They competed for production speed, for cost efficiency, for innovation in construction methods. Kaiser's revolutionary techniques emerged from competitive pressure, from the need to outperform rivals and win additional contracts. The profit motive aligned with national interest, creating incentive structures that drove productivity beyond what central planning achieved in Germany. The workforce that built these ships included people German ideology deemed inferior. Women welders in Richmond proved as capable as male craftsmen in Hamburg. African American workers supervised construction teams with competence that mocked Nazi racial theory. The democracy the Germans considered weak and decadent demonstrated organizational capacity and productive efficiency that authoritarian Germany could not match. The contradiction destroyed German strategic assumptions at every level, proved through production statistics that ideology was no substitute for industrial capability. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The Kriegsmarine that was supposed to dominate the Atlantic finished the war with most of its submarine fleet destroyed, its surface ships sunk or trapped in port, its ambitious construction plans abandoned years earlier when material shortages made continued building impossible. Plan Z, the grand naval program that would have given Germany maritime supremacy, never materialized. The 6 H-class battleships were never completed. The aircraft carriers remained unfinished. The destroyers and cruisers and submarines that were supposed to number in the hundreds existed mostly as canceled contracts and abandoned construction projects. The United States Navy, meanwhile, had grown into the most powerful naval force in human history. 27 large aircraft carriers, 9 light carriers, 85 escort carriers, 4 battleships, hundreds of destroyers and submarines and auxiliary vessels. The fleet that entered peacetime service exceeded the combined naval strength of every other nation. American shipyards had not merely supported the war effort, they had created permanent naval supremacy that would shape global politics for generations. The Liberty ships continued crossing oceans, carrying the supplies that rebuilt Europe. They became instruments of peace as they had been instruments of war, physical manifestations of the same industrial capacity that had overwhelmed German military production. The Marshall Plan shipped food and machinery and materials to reconstruct shattered nations, using merchant vessels built in wartime for peacetime purposes. American abundance, the surplus productive capacity that had seemed like propaganda to German generals, rebuilt the continent those generals had tried to conquer. The lesson was written in steel and welding and prefabricated hull sections, in the ungainly Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic, bearing the weight of democracy's industrial might. Speed had triumphed over craftsmanship, scale had defeated quality, mass production, the American innovation that German traditionalists had dismissed, had proven decisive not through superiority of individual units but through overwhelming quantity that rendered superiority irrelevant. The German U-boat was arguably the finest submarine in the world, superior to American designs in speed and range and capability. But technical excellence meant nothing when confronted with production rates that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. The generals who had studied at military academies, who had learned strategy and tactics and the principles of warfare, had missed the fundamental truth that industrial capacity determines military outcomes in modern war. They planned campaigns assuming rough parity of production, calculating force ratios and supply requirements based on the assumption that both sides faced similar constraints. They discovered that America operated under different rules, that a nation with unlimited raw materials, advanced infrastructure, skilled labor, and 2 ocean barriers, protecting its factories from bombing, could produce war material at rates that made conventional strategic planning obsolete. The story of American shipbuilding in 1943 was not merely a tale of industrial achievement. It was proof that democracy, for all its apparent inefficiency and messy pluralism, could mobilize resources more effectively than totalitarianism. The German system of central planning and authoritarian control had seemed more efficient, more capable of focusing national effort towards single purposes. But American capitalism, with its competitive pressures and profit incentives and distributed decision-making, produced better results. The shipyard workers who built Liberty ships in 42 days were not following orders from Berlin-style central planners. They were employees of private companies competing for government contracts, motivated by wages and overtime pay and pride in production records. The welding itself became symbolic. Riveting, the traditional method, required teams of skilled workers, a heater to warm the rivet, a holder to position it, a riveter to hammer it into place, a bucker to support the backside. 4 skilled men to place 1 rivet. Welding required 1 person with equipment that could be taught in weeks rather than years. The efficiency gain was multiplicative. Ships that would have required hundreds of riveters needed dozens of welders. The labor savings translated directly into construction speed, allowing the same workforce to produce more vessels in less time. German shipyards never made this transition effectively. They continued riveting because that was how ships had always been built. Because master craftsmen resisted new methods. Because the guild system and traditional training created organizational inertia that prevented rapid adaptation. When German yards finally began adopting welding techniques late in the war, they lacked the workforce trained in the method, lacked the institutional knowledge to implement it efficiently, lacked the time to develop the production systems that American yards had perfected through years of experience. The Kaiser shipyards became a university of industrial warfare, teaching lessons that would shape manufacturing for generations. The techniques developed to build Liberty ships, prefabrication, modular construction, just-in-time supply chains, specialized labor, spread throughout American industry. The women who learned welding in shipyards carried those skills into peacetime employment. The organizational methods that produced ships every 42 days influenced post-war manufacturing in automotive plants and electronics factories and aerospace facilities. The Industrial Revolution that overwhelmed Germany did not end with victory. It accelerated into the economic expansion that made America the world's dominant industrial power. The German generals surveying the ruins of the Reich in 1945 understood finally what they had faced. The reports they had dismissed as propaganda were understatements. The production figures they had considered impossible were conservative estimates. The industrial capacity they had calculated would take years to mobilize had been operational within months. Every assumption upon which German strategy rested had been wrong, not marginally but catastrophically. Wrong in ways that made defeat inevitable from the moment America entered the war. The Liberty ship, that ungainly product of assembly line efficiency, had proven more decisive than the Bismarck, more powerful than Plan Z, more significant than any weapon system Germany deployed, not because of superior design or technical excellence, but because 2,710 of them existed, each one representing American industrial capacity that Germany could not match. Could not sink fast enough, could not compete against. The bridge of ships that Roosevelt had promised, the constant stream of vessels that Goering had believed and feared, had materialized exactly as described. The final irony was that America had accomplished this transformation while maintaining civilian prosperity that exceeded German peacetime standards. Rationing existed but was mild compared to European deprivation. Americans continued eating beef and sugar and coffee throughout the war. They endured restrictions but not starvation. The economy that supported military production also supported consumer consumption at levels that made German civilians' sacrifices seem pointless. America had waged total war without requiring total sacrifice, had mobilized completely while preserving the prosperity that made democracy worth defending. The harbor in Richmond, California, where the Robert E. Peary had slid into San Francisco Bay in November 1942, continued operating after the war. The shipways that had produced Liberty ships at record speed built merchant vessels and tankers and container ships in peacetime. The workers who had learned their trades under wartime pressure became the skilled labor force of the post-war boom. The yards eventually closed, displaced by foreign competition and changing economic conditions, but the legacy endured. The industrial transformation that had overwhelmed German military power reshaped global manufacturing, established patterns of mass production, and distributed supply chains that defined modern industry. The German generals had been stunned, not by a single innovation or technological breakthrough, but by systemic industrial capacity, by an economic structure that could produce overwhelming material superiority while maintaining democratic freedoms and capitalist competition. They had believed totalitarian efficiency would triumph over democratic chaos. They discovered that markets, properly motivated, could mobilize resources more effectively than central planning. They expected American workers to be soft. They encountered a workforce that had survived the Depression and brought grim determination to wartime production. They assumed racial ideology reflected reality. They found that diversity and inclusion produced industrial results that homogeneous authoritarianism could not match. The numbers tell the story that German generals could not accept until defeat forced recognition. In 1943, the United States built more ships than Germany constructed during the entire war. 2,710 Liberty ships, 531 Victory ships, 114 escort carriers, hundreds of destroyers and submarines and auxiliary vessels, tonnage totals that dwarfed German production, a merchant fleet that crossed oceans carrying the supplies that sustained armies, fed populations, rebuilt nations. Ships built not through superior craftsmanship or traditional methods, but through American innovation that rejected conventional wisdom and embraced speed and scale and mass production efficiency. The lesson was learned through defeat, through the grinding arithmetic of industrial warfare that proved ideology and will and courage were insufficient substitutes for productive capacity. The German soldiers who fought with skill and dedication, the U-boat crews who braved Atlantic storms, the factory workers who labored under Allied bombing, all had given their utmost to a cause that industrial mathematics made unwinnable. The generals who had dismissed American production claims as propaganda had sent those soldiers and sailors and workers into a contest where the outcome was determined before the first battle, where German courage faced American abundance and discovered that abundance, properly mobilized, could not be overcome. The Liberty ships sailed into history as monuments to democratic industrial power, floating proof that free societies could mobilize for total war, while preserving the freedoms that made them worth defending. They were not elegant. They were not sophisticated. They were not examples of superior German engineering precision. They were effective, produced in quantities that made German production irrelevant, built by a workforce that Nazi ideology declared inferior, but that proved capable of industrial achievement beyond what German master craftsmen could accomplish. The ships themselves became arguments for democracy, physical evidence that freedom and diversity and competitive capitalism could achieve results that authoritarian efficiency promised but never delivered. November 1943, Atlantic Ocean. A Liberty ship crossed eastward, one of 3 leaving American ports that day, carrying tanks and trucks and ammunition and food. In the hold were crates containing machinery for field hospitals, spare parts for aircraft, communications equipment, medical supplies, the mundane logistics of war. The cargo represented American productive capacity, the surplus output of factories operating at scales German planners had considered impossible. The ship was one among thousands, unremarkable except for what it represented. The industrial transformation that had stunned German generals and proved that democracy, when threatened, could mobilize resources more effectively than any totalitarian state. The vessel sailed through waters where U-boats had once hunted freely, where wolf packs had threatened to starve Britain into submission. Those same waters now teemed with Allied ships, merchant convoys protected by escort carriers built using Kaiser's techniques, destroyers and frigates produced faster than Germany could sink them, a maritime dominance secured not through tactical brilliance, but through overwhelming industrial output. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won in American shipyards, decided by workers in Richmond and Portland and Wilmington who probably never fully understood how their labor determined the war's outcome. The German generals had been stunned because they had believed what their ideology taught them, accepted comfortable myths about racial superiority and totalitarian efficiency, and the weakness of democracy. They had measured American capability by European standards and assumed similar constraints. They discovered that America operated under different rules, that a nation built on immigration and innovation and capitalist competition could achieve industrial results that exceeded anything authoritarian central planning produced. The realization came too late, after commitments had been made and strategies implemented and armies deployed based on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. The Liberty ship continued eastward, unremarkable and ungainly, built in 42 days by semi-skilled workers using techniques that violated every principle of traditional shipbuilding. It represented American pragmatism over German precision, democratic chaos over authoritarian order, abundance over scarcity. It was one ship among thousands, built in 1943 in yards that would produce more tonnage that year than Germany constructed during the entire war. The vessel itself mattered less than what it symbolized: industrial capacity beyond imagination, mobilization beyond prediction, democracy proving itself in the most fundamental way possible, through production rates that overwhelmed enemy forces and made German victory mathematically impossible. The generals who had studied warfare, who had learned strategy from histories of Napoleon and Clausewitz, had missed the essential truth of modern conflict. Industrial capacity determines outcomes, Production rates matter more than tactical brilliance. An army can be brilliantly led, magnificently trained, equipped with superior weapons, and still lose because the enemy can replace losses faster, can field more soldiers, can sustain longer campaigns, can produce overwhelming material superiority that renders tactical excellence irrelevant. The German generals understood this truth intellectually, but never grasped its implications, never fully comprehended that American industrial capacity made German military skill meaningless in any extended conflict. The war was decided not at Normandy or Stalingrad or in the Battle of Britain, but in American factories and shipyards where workers who had never built ships before learned welding in weeks and produced vessels at rates that made German submarine warfare pointless. The decision was made when democracy proved it could mobilize more effectively than totalitarianism, when capitalism demonstrated superior resource allocation compared to central planning, when diversity achieved better results than racial homogeneity. The victory was won through the unglamorous arithmetic of production statistics, through industrial output that German generals dismissed as impossible until it buried them under an avalanche of ships and planes and tanks. The lesson remains. Industrial capacity matters. Production rates determine outcomes. Innovation trumps tradition. Democracy, properly motivated, can achieve results that authoritarian efficiency promises but never delivers. The Liberty ships proved these truths through the simple fact of their existence, through construction times that violated German assumptions, through abundance that German scarcity could not match. They were monuments to American industrial power, floating arguments for democracy, physical proof that freedom and capitalism and diversity could win wars against authoritarian efficiency and racial ideology and totalitarian control. The German generals were stunned because they had been wrong about everything that mattered. Wrong about American resolve, wrong about industrial capacity, wrong about the power of democracy, wrong about the fundamental nature of modern warfare. The ships that crossed the Atlantic in 1943 carried not just supplies but proof of these errors. Evidence written in steel and welding and prefabricated sections that no amount of skill or courage or ideology could overcome. The generals learned through defeat what they had refused to accept through intelligence reports. America could build more ships in 1 year than Germany produced during the entire war, and that single fact determined the outcome of everything that followed.